Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6, Chronicles of UK Salafism, an Insider Perspective. This particular episode shall focus on the year 2005. And in doing so, I want to refer to a challenge that urban Salafi communities faced at the time, which extended right back to the early 90s. And that was none other than a minority of converts who had a criminal background being enticed by an extremist narrative on propaganda that to continue that criminality as Muslims was actually rewarding, meritorious, because of the distorted construct of this propaganda that they were living in an abode of war, or Dar al-Harb, as it was known. So this was a challenge to try and bring that minority of individuals away from that, as well as the politicized, toxic ideology that will take them on a path towards violent extremism in that instance. And the media were picking up on this as well, because I have an article here dated the 21st of January 2005 by the journalist Ben Ashford. And he mentions here, quote, "Muslim leaders today warn thugs and extremists not to blacken the good name of their religion." In an exclusive interview with the South London Press, mosque officials reveal fears that criminals are quote unquote masquerading as Muslims and coercing young people into joining gangs with threats of violence. They speak of a minority of young men who, spurred on by violent images from Afghanistan and Iraq, are deliberately misinterpreting their religion's teachings and cajoling others into joining them. But the leaders are determined their peaceful community should not suffer any backlash because of a mindless minority. A joint statement from officials at Brixton Mosque and Stockwell Mosque read, quote, "This behaviour is unacceptable and repugnant and is causing harm to the Muslim community," close quote. I'll read the final excerpt of this long article, in which it goes on to say, quote, "Leading members of South London's Muslim community met this week to spell out a stark message to thugs and extremists looking to join their ranks. Quote, keep away from our mosques," close quote. So the fact that this was receiving attention from mainstream media, albeit local on this occasion, as we proceed, you'll hear me refer to Muslim boys, so-called notorious gang that drew fear in the South London area. But the fact that criminality was being associated with Muslims was a reality that was taking place. There were individuals threatening violence against fellow gang members unless they took Shahada. We did experience individuals coming into the mosque, very small number, fearful that if they didn't leave as Muslims, that they would be maimed, harmed, or even killed at the worst case scenario. That was not a reason to take Shahada, and we as a community, as management and administration, would not encourage that. Advice was given, dawah was given, propagation was given to let them know about the tenets of Islam, and that any embracing the religion had to be sincere. Later on in 2005, around May, June, we saw unprecedented numbers embrace the religion sincerely. Some whole estates embraced Islam after leaders of gangs that were in prison had embraced Islam. had embraced Islam, and the message had gone out to their colleagues and the foot soldiers who were among them, and we saw them coming in droves. We even saw, yes, I was living in Saudi Arabia, but these reports were coming to me, and when I travel back to the UK, they were being verified. We even had young school girls who were attending Catholic schools coming and taking Shahada, putting their hijabs on when they went into the mosque, and when they were leaving, you could see them with their school uniforms going back to school and the like. So we saw unprecedented numbers, and across May, June, 300 to 400 shahadas took place in that particular year, 2005. And it was such that Central Mosque, Regent's Park Mosque, when African Caribbean converts, white converts, individuals wanted to convert to Islam, they were actually being directed to Brixton Mosque from that particular year from Regent's Park Mosque, which is quite significant considering that many used to go and continue to go to Regent's Park Mosque. So that was in January. The year, or first few months of the year, Brixton and other Salafi communities continued to get varying levels of attention from the media, even the security services, from a distance albeit, because of our socially conservative and orthodox practice of Islam, and suspicion was very, very much on us. Some communities were very active in writing and dispelling myths and negativities around Islam generally and Salafiyah secondly. But at this stage, the Salafi communities up and down the country continued, as they had in the 90s, to be the foremost confronters of violent extremism and terrorism and the Khariji ideology, and were churning out information, details, counter-narratives. And I have here in front of me, for example, from the then leader of the Luton community, Call to Islam and Masjid al-Ghuraba, Abdul Qadir Bashk, who's now doing some very effective charity and relief work in various parts of the world. And I've got here one pamphlet by him, The Early Khawarij Sect and Takfiris of Today, Muslim Terrorist, The Myth, again by Abdul Qadir, The Evil End of a Terrorist, again, Abdul Qadir Bakhsh, Islamic Radicalism and its Roots and Causes, by him again. And then I've got a 3-part series of pamphlets by him refuting Islam. The first one was, again, about the Khawarij ideology. Another one was about the misrepresentation and distortion of the noble verses in Surah Ma'idah, the explanation concerning whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, such are the disbelievers, a very popular verse that the extremist ideologues like to quote and misquote, misrepresent. And then part 3 was concerning the scholars saying regarding judgment by other than what Allah has revealed. And the fourth part, it's a 4-part series. The fourth one from him was sincere advice to those who make takfir. And these were just a small number of really attractive, informative and knowledge-based leaflets that were being put out, as well as a number of other booklets and everything from various communities up and down the country. Unfortunately, there was still that undercurrent, and I referred to it in the previous episode as an irritant, in that the Salafi publications, Cult and their affiliates, were still making hegemonic moves or attempts to make hegemonic moves, and negativity was still emanating from them, and unfortunately affecting, or I wouldn't say influencing, but it was affecting some of the scholars that we all used to go to regularly. And evidence of this is an email from our Imam Umar Urquhart, the Brixton Imam, when he was visited on the 22nd of June, Wednesday the 22nd of June, because he wrote an email to us to this effect, and it stated, "Meeting today with Khalid Bagais and Akh Fuad." Khalid Bagais, Abu Ziyad, was and is a Saudi who studied in Essex University when some of the individuals were closer. Some of them from Brixton knew him and became Muslim in Essex University. We know that Amjad Rafiq was also attending that university, as were a number of other individuals. So he visited the UK after a long period, and it was also to represent or convey a message from Sheikh Rabi'. And I'll read the email to give an idea of the distractive nature with the focus of this cult on what we would see as micro issues in the face of the macro events that we were facing post 9/11, post the invasion of Iraq in 2003, post the Madrid bombings, post so many other things that were beginning to affect the Muslims and how we were being viewed in the UK and the West, and how the Salafi community in particular were being more focused upon because of some liberal narratives that were pointing the finger at us. They'd initially pointed the finger at Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood type figures. And then when that was successful, and we saw that because Muslim Council of Britain, as we will see, became no longer the poster boy and close to the government. They were ostracized because of some of their affiliations with Muslim Brotherhood. Once that denigration was successful by these liberal groups, and we know who these individuals are, Ed Hussein and Majid Nawaz, Quilliam et al., when they started focusing on the Salafi movement and speaking to government and other left-wing organizations, so neo-conservative organizations and groups, that's when we found ourselves having to really try and consolidate and respond. So, but coming to this email, all of that was happening, but yet this minor and small but vocal cult element were focusing on something altogether different. So the email reads, Assalamu alaikum. As I had indicated, this is from Imam Umar to his colleagues. I had a visit by Akh Khalid, Fawad al-Amri, and Taqweem from the UK, and a fourth person that didn't sit with us. And he said, in brief, Khalid said that Sheikh Rabi' sent his salams and asked about Abul Hassan al-Ma'rabi and the masjid relation with regards to Abu Usama al-Dhahabi, and also our relationship with Abdul Qadir in Luton. And in saying all of that, he put a quick disclaimer, and Sheikh Rabi speaks good of me. His words after that were, that's the buttering up part for me to jump into deep water. I didn't answer and just told them we may soon come down to Saudi and hope to sit with the Sheikh. He mentioned here that one of the visitors who with them, Taqweem, played hide and seek. He mainly stayed outside the room. And then he concluded in summarizing this meeting saying these visitors spent 6 days in Cardiff because there was a Salafi Publications associates there. They spent another 6 days in Birmingham, where the Salafi Publications head office is, and an hour with us. And almost bemusedly, he said, Jazakallah khair, may Allah bless them, talk later. And he ended on that point there. So it goes to show that despite the efforts of some entities, Salafi community groups across the country, I've referred to Abdul Qadir and the community he was presiding over and leading. I'm highlighting some of the challenges that we were having at Brixton. This entity were more interested at this particular stage in this micro infighting amongst the Salafis to try and rein and control the propagation and the dawah. And they still hadn't succeeded at that stage. Now, that was in June, that email. We don't need much reminding as to what occurred the following month. And I'm talking of none other than 7th of July 2005, attacks in London. And before going into that in detail, and I do want to spend some time on that because that was the UK's 9/11 moment, and the ramifications succeeding that were reverberated for years to come. And up until that time, there had been approximately, on the small scale, significant scale, 36 attacks across the globe. I'm not including everything, but I'm going to mention some of them from October 2000. So we saw the Yemen suicide bombers who directed an attack against USS Cole in Aden. November 2000, 2 British citizens of Bangladeshi origin were arrested in Birmingham on suspicion of preparing a large quantity of homemade explosives. We saw September 11th, the Twin Towers and everything that happened there. We saw the shoe bomber, Richard Reed, December 2001. In January 2002, there was the kidnapping and execution of the US journalist Daniel Pearl in Pakistan. We know very recently, a few weeks ago, they commuted the death sentence of the perpetrator to a life imprisonment. April 2002, Tunisia, there was an attack on Western tourists at a synagogue in Tunisia. Again, May 2002, there was an attack in Pakistan that affected French naval engineers in Karachi. I can go on. 2002, we saw a number of attacks. I mentioned previously the Beslan crisis in 2002 and the murders that had taken place then. And sorry, not 2002. This was another one, the Chechen terrorists occupying the Moscow theatre with hundreds of hostages then. That was 2002. But Beslan was the subsequent year. There were events in Saudi Arabia in 2003. There were the Madrid attacks from last year that I mentioned, 2004. So leading up to July 2005, 7/7, it would have made sense, one would think, that the Salafi communities would have been united, would have been much more solidified as a unit in churning out and producing a consolidated front and literature and videos and lectures to really rebut the accusations that were increasing, almost tsunami-like, against the Salafi ideology and Salafis in themselves and the derogative term Wahhabiyya. And that didn't happen. We were all countering in our respective communities. I will now focus on the events of the 7th of July. And I want to just read briefly an account of that day from a book, a very informative book, The London Bombings, an Independent Inquiry, authored by Nafis Mossadegh Ahmed. And I want to read that and then go into detail about that day and how it affected us and the events that followed throughout the weeks, months, and that year. So, starting with chapter 1 from this author. On 7th of July 2005, London came under attack. 4 bombs had detonated in the heart of the city. 3 had exploded almost simultaneously at separate locations on the London Underground, within 50 seconds of one another, starting at 8:51 a.m. The first went off on the eastbound Circle Line Underground train between Liverpool Street and Aldgate, 8 minutes after the train had departed King's Cross St Pancras tube station. The second bomb went off on a westbound Circle Line Underground train at Edgware Road Station, 8 minutes after its departure from King's Cross. Survivors described how the explosion ripped open a train carriage like a can opener, blowing open the floor, sides and roof of the carriage and shattering the train's windows. A train passing in the opposite direction had its side blown out as it passed by the explosion, hurling one commuter under its wheels. The third bomb exploded on southbound Piccadilly Line Underground train after its departure from King's Cross, St Pancras, towards Russell Square. We were only a few minutes out of King's Cross when this happened, according to Grace Hormigos, a 58-year-old housekeeper from Tottenham, North London. Terrified survivors described bodies slumped on seats, commuters who had lost limbs, glass tearing through skin and choking smoke. They could hear endless screams from the adjacent carriage. Jumping down to another excerpt on the same page, this was the most devastating bombing in London since the Second World War. 52 civilians had been killed and more than 700 were injured. It was also clearly a carefully planned and sophisticated terrorist operation involving the use of multiple, almost simultaneous, coordinated attacks designed to paralyze the city through disruption of its public transport system. But the terror was not over. And before I continue concluding those excerpts, the terror was not over. And after this attack, let's stay with this for the moment. Many of us will remember what we were doing on that particular occasion. I was living in Jeddah. My family had just returned that morning from the UK and had used the same London Underground system to travel over to Heathrow Airport. But I wrote this after the 7/7 attacks on the 14th of July to a colleague. This was an email, and I entitled it, "Unfortunately, the dark clouds still remain." And this is what I wrote. "I have no prior knowledge of what will happen tomorrow. Only Allah knows this. But everyone knows that it's going to rain when they see black clouds looming in the sky above them. We saw these clouds looming overhead many years ago, and despite our warnings, nothing significant was done. Those clouds have not disappeared. Unless the authorities establish effective communicative channels with the right people, I fear you'll see more of those unfortunate and frightening events that unfolded last week." Now, when I say we warned, let's go back to that, because there were the accusations, as you heard me refer to in the previous episodes, of us being called informers and such like. We've always given warnings to our community and attendees on our minbars, on our pulpits, in our writings about the ideology, the destructive ideology of the Khariji movement, violent extremist movement. That is what our warnings extend to, and nothing more. That needs to be made clear, and I think I emphasised that previously, and the evidence has since been established, even for those detractors who have had to come and on some occasions, as I've mentioned, apologise. So that was on the 14th of July. Continuing with Nafis Ahmed's book again, "But the terror was not over," as he states, quote, "2 weeks later, on the 21st day of the month, there were 4 attempted bomb attacks in London. The first explosion occurred at 12:26 p.m. on a train at Shepherd's Bush tube station. 4 minutes later, there was another explosion on a train at Oval tube station. Then in a further 15 minutes, a third explosion occurred at Warren Street tube station. The final explosion was at 1:30 p.m. on a bus in Bethnal Green. There were no fatalities, as the explosions were very small." Now, the following day, the 22nd of July, attention was focused on the South London area again, this time Stockwell, which is the penultimate stop on the Victoria line before you end and disembark at Brixton. And the next day, as I've mentioned, shortly after 10 a.m., continuing with the book, quote, "Charles de Menezes was chased and shot to death at Stockwell tube station by undercover police officers. They had been following him from a building under surveillance in connection with the terrorism investigations. He had been shot several times in the head at close range. Police claimed they believed he was a possible suicide bomber, but it quickly emerged, and police were compelled to admit the following day, that he was an innocent man who had no connection to the terrorist attacks." Close quote. And memorial and a plaque remain at Stockwell tube station today since that assassination, as some of us considered it. And those from South London who know Stockwell know how vibrant that particular area is. And it's a short walk from Brixton, about a 10-minute, 15-minute brisk walk from Brixton. I was actually born in Stockwell, about 500 metres down the road, a former private nursing hospital. So the shock for me and colleagues, members of the Brixton Mosque community and other Muslims who associate with the Stockwell Mosque community were shocked and appalled and very, very nervous about what this all symbolised, because once again, the spotlight was firmly upon us as a South London community. The following day also of this assassination, this murder of this innocent individual, we saw in the media an almost minute by minute account of the pace in which the police were undergoing investigations. So the BBC, for example, on the 8th of July, they gave an account from 6:30 in the morning where the anti-terrorism officers launched a series of raids on 6 houses in the Leeds area. They provide statements from a Scotland Yard commissioner at the time, Sir Ian Blair, about the operation in West Yorkshire. That was at 9 o'clock. We see right up until 5:30 that the operations are obviously continuing and accelerating. We see that particular areas were cleared out in the north as they were suspecting houses containing bombs. I don't want to focus too much on those, but just to show the attention that was actually there. Tony Blair called the usual suspects in and made a statement on the lawn of the Commons that they're going to fight and combat extremism. And many Muslims were agitated by this, frustrated by this, because the individuals that were there and standing side by side with Tony Blair were not representative of the wider Muslim communities. What I want to focus on at this particular juncture is, again, our involvement from Brixton, and in focusing on that, to show more of the fissures that were happening within our own community as a result of this attack, or these attacks. So on the 3rd of August, I was contacted by journalist Lisa Scott to provide some insight and to answer some of her questions regarding the 7/7 attacks. Before I go into my article, because I want to read it in its entirety, it was for the Metro and it was meant to be a front page lead. It was subsequently moved to the second page. I want to explain who Lisa Scott is and how I came to actually know her. And we would have to go back to 2001, post 9/11, maybe a month afterwards. I was in Croydon with my wife at Waterstone's bookstore. She was searching for a particular book. And I saw this young lady looking at the main book stands, which had all these sensationalist headlines about Muslims, terrorism, bombings, and the like. And as she was scouring through these, I actually said to her, because I was standing near there looking at them myself, it would be better for you if you went to a mosque and met community members, male and or female, who could give you better insight into Islam and our practices. And she thanked me for that, and she asked if she could have my number to find out which mosque she could go to. She subsequently called me and said, can I come and visit you instead with my uncle? Because I'm an undergrad, University of London, and I want to do research on this, so it would be better if I came and visited you with my uncle to interview you. I agreed. She came, she sat with me, her uncle as well, and we embarked on a very long interview. She did very well in the degree, not because of myself, but I think that her research was thorough, and she got a distinction, and she sent me her degree, which I still have to this day. So that's who Lisa Scott was, and she then became a journalist for the Metro. So when she called me, I was actually in Medina with some colleagues. A friend had come over because there'd been a bereavement with the children's mother, and we were in Medina, and I was actually on Mount Uhud while the children were doing ziyarah and looking at this famous site. I was on Mount Uhud, where the archers, those who know Islamic history, the archers were initially positioned in that particular battle. So she called me, and I pulled away from the main crowd and continued to conduct the interview with her. And this is how the article was presented. And I want to read it in its entirety, and then I'm going to refer to my emails to her to show how media can distort, edit final pieces to make it appear more dramatic and sensationalized than it was. And I don't hold Lisa Scott entirely responsible, although she is a contributory factor, but her email showed that she did try to present and clarify with me particular aspects that I wanted in the piece. So here is the article, 3rd of August 2005, and it began, Britain should expect a third or even fourth wave of terror attacks. One of the country's most influential Muslim leaders has warned. The threat is far greater than that faced by the US after 9/11, said Abdulhak Baker, chairman of the Brixton Mosque, once attended by shoe bomber Richard Reed. Mr. Baker laid blame for the security crisis squarely at the door of Tony Blair for his support of the American-led invasion of Iraq. Quote from me, "The bombers did what they thought needed to be done. They wanted to show their objection to what is happening in the Muslim world at the hands of the West," he told the Metro. Continuing my quote, "Bush and Blair have fueled future extremist attackers, and now their war on terror has backfired. What happened last month is proof of it." Quote, close quote. The 39-year-old said that jihad, holy war, can be justified in some cases. Quoting me again, "It is obligatory for every Muslim. There are different levels and it is only permissible when it comes to defending Allah and Islam." Close quote. Before I continue with the article, I think that any discerning ear will know that that could not have been a quote that from any Muslim, that it's permissible when it comes to defending Allah. Allah is not in need of any defense and this is for those non-Muslims who may be listening to this particular podcast. So here clearly is a pointer to a distortion or an addition to what I had said. Continuing with the article, he added, quote, "If a Muslim country is attacked, then individuals in that country will want to defend themselves. But jihad should never be used for greed or gain," close quote. Brixton Mosque in South London is considered to be one of the city's more extreme. Felled shoe bomber Richard Reed was a regular worshipper, and 9/11 attacker Zacarias Moussaoui was said to have worshipped there. New reports claim July 7th bomber Jermaine Lindsay and July 21st suspect Mukhtar Said Ibrahim may have also attended the mosque. But Baker said his mosque was moderate and orthodox. Quoting me again, "We are not familiar with any of the July 7th or July 21st bombers attending here, and we do not teach extreme Muslim ideologies," he said. He said he was close to young impressionable Muslims he fears are the target of extremist recruiters and warned against anger. And Baker did condemn the terrorists, adding, "These recruiters are cowards and hypocrites." End of the article. Now, I refer immediately to the email from Lita Scott 2 days before it was published. And she writes here, "Hi Abdulhak, I'm just about to send you the full story, but is this correct?" And she quotes me. "While Baker says that Western foreign policy is the primary reason behind the terror attacks, he also says that the Muslim world needs to take on some responsibility too. He fears that many Muslims are neglecting the fundamentals of the religion because they are not worshipping Allah alone. Quoting me, "I have found that many Muslims are also worshipping astrologers, soothsayers and graves. This causes weaknesses and mistakes in their worship." Close my quote. So then she asked me what advice would I give to Muslims who are steering off the traditional path of worship. I responded to correct her in this particular email and the remainder of the email and of the article. And when this article came out, I did write to her asking what had happened because of the misquoting. However, there were some aspects that were correct. I did hold Tony Blair responsible for making the focus of extremists inwards, homegrown as it were, because of him aligning himself with Bush and the US with their war on terror in Iraq. Now, continuing, and this is where the fractures started happening even more amongst ourselves as colleagues, because emails started coming about and some of the colleagues started really lamenting, if I could say that, by saying that my interview had taken us back 20 years. I'm reading an article here, and one of my colleagues, the press and media representative, he responded and rebutted that, saying, with regards to the recent Metro article with AHB, myself, which I do not think took us back 20 years or caused concern, he addressed that. He then said, even though many may not agree with AHB speaking, it has to be acknowledged that he is one of a few that are willing to speak to the press, even though the press may twist and chop his words. Then he mentioned the head of Stockwell Mosque. The issue with Taha Qureshi speaking outside the Brixton Mosque when other brothers were there and could have also spoken demonstrates why AHB is also needed. And what he was referring to in that instance is on the day, later on that day, or if I'm correct, shortly after the attacks, we had MP Kate Hoy, Borough Commander of Lambeth Police, Martin Bridger, and others come and stand outside Brixton Mosque, and including the Lambeth Council leader at the time, Councillor Peter Truesdale. And the media converged outside the mosque. And these individuals represented the mosque and pointed behind them and said, this place is not a den of extremism. The embarrassing thing was that management were in the mosque at the time, the imam and other members of the management, and they shut the door firmly and would not come out. Some were looking out of the window. And the media officer was frustrated about that because I was on the phone, I was called, he aired his frustration. He lives in Leighton, or was living in Leighton at the time, East London, yet they called him to get on the underground and get down there. Some may make an excuse and say, well, they weren't confident enough, they needed people to articulate. However, many among that administration at the time, my colleagues, were the ones who were causing and criticising any representation to such a degree that they wanted to say that there shouldn't be press representation except by this one individual, which was very unfortunate. And this was frustrating for me because there was an absence of leadership in this instance. And like what happened with the Richard Reid situation, there needed to be immediate representation to counter any narratives or any negative press that would hold us as a community to be responsible or a catalyst for violent extremism. Unfortunately, some of the criticism that emanated from fellow trustees and colleagues at the time, and this is documented in emails that I have in front of me, is that they felt that my response and interview had set back opportunities of receiving funding. And this surprised me because during my complete tenure of as chairman of the mosque up until 2009, I continued to be in charge despite me living abroad at the time. One of the things that we were very careful about was who and how we obtained funding. So when I saw this email criticising me, and I'll read aspects of it, where a comment was made from one of the trustees in writing to the press officer, Lee Jasper, who is a local community leader, who has a lot of money that he can give to the community, is waiting for us to demonstrate that we are professionally enough for him to recommend us for this money, with which we could do a lot of good in the community. And close quote at that instance. And seeing this and seeing the nature of politics that some wanted to embark upon, which was not to speak directly or as emphatically as I had spoken, laying the blame to the UK government for foreign policy, as had been said after me and continues to be said up until to date, and the government has now accepted this. It was surprising that that was being criticised. In part, there were other areas, of course, because there was a focus and concentration on obtaining funding from a local personality. And then this individual went on to say to the press officer, I know for sure that if, and he names another trustee, I were to speak with the same speech as is reported to have been said by Abdul Haq, myself, we would be exposed to disciplinary measures by our workplaces. Okay, and that's not strictly speaking true, because if we go back to the Richard Reid affair, when my employers became aware of the global attention that had been paid to the mosque and my speech, they approached me from a very senior level, and they showed support and offered even further support to the extent that I was able to work from home part-time. I had my own special parking allocation as they realised there were particular risks if I was going to be coming on the underground every day. And they continue to offer any support if I needed counselling services and such like. So this individual saying there would have been disciplinary action and measures taken against them was a red flag, a false flag, and inaccurate. But it began to show the negativity and fissures, as I've mentioned previously, amongst us at a microcosmic level, at a management level, community level, which fortunately became worse for various reasons as the years progressed. The minutes that I see here from the 26th of July, the operational manager, he puts down some directives that I'd asked him to do, where he quotes, Abdul Haq suggested that I coordinate press activities and other bits while the current situation continues. They were referring to a press call on Saturday, a joint statement read by the leader of Lambeth Council, and with the intention of removing the current stigma attached to the mosque. He highlighted here that it was agreed by all that a more joined up approach with one central focal point was required, and they discussed meetings with the borough commander and Deputy Assistant Commander Brian Paddock at the time, Lee Jasper again on the 28th of that month, and plans for the forthcoming conference with Sheikh Mohammed Maliki. So these are minutes that I'm actually looking at. One of the things that I want to move to now, and that was what occurred amongst Muslim communities following the 7/7 bomb attacks. And it was quite positive, I have to say. And I've got a BBC article here dated the 29th, Friday the 29th of July, 2005, entitled Muslim Events to Debate Bombings. And it refers to Muslims hosting a number of events around the country with conferences debating terrorism. And it read in the beginning, just weeks after the attacks, events are starting to be held throughout the UK by a wide range of Muslim groups. And it refers to one of them, Live in Islam, a festival that will be hosted by the Islamic Society of Britain. It then refers to a more extreme element, the same article, Radical Party. It refers to Hizb ut-Tahrir, who predicted more than 1,000 Muslims would attend the event. They were not prescribed at this particular time, but shortly thereafter. And it highlighted their beliefs that HT is considered to be one on the fringe of Islam in Britain, and its members believe that Western society is incompatible with Islam, end quote, at that instance. And then there's a subheading here, and this was amongst the first for Salafi communities in the UK, and it had a title here, Salafi Lectures. And many have not heard me speak favourably of this sect and this entity before, up until now, because of the problems with it. But when we are giving historical accounts, it's only befitting that justice and a nuanced narrative is given. And in this instance, I do have to commend Salafi publications for bringing to the attention of the mainstream media an event that they were going to host. And I'll read what it says concerning that event under the subheading Salafi Lectures. In yet another sign that full debate is taking place, followers of the Salafi sect of Islam, a conservative or pure reading of the faith, are organising lectures to speak against the attacks. Some Western analysts have associated Salafist thinking with Al-Qaeda because some militant groups in the Middle East describe themselves by the same name. But British followers of the sect say the association is completely wrong because they themselves have been targeted by militants for speaking out. Scholars linked to the Birmingham-based Salafi publications will explain why they say Islam condemns suicide bombers as perpetrators of evil. Organisers are inviting non-Muslims to also attend the lectures starting on Friday evening's debate in Bradford. Further debates will be held at mosques in Birmingham and London throughout. So this was commendable because it showed the Salafi involvement. It was the Focus on Salafi Publications conference. And this is the type of a unity and positive image that we should have been espousing post 2001, 9/11, to show that Salafism is the antidote to violent extremism. I'll move on to other events that were taking place before we draw to a conclusion. And I'd received an email from a former imam from Jordan, Brother Mutazim, and he wrote to me saying that he's going to be writing for an official newspaper in Jordan, and they want an article that will illustrate for the readers that Islam is free from terrorism. And the points of the article were 5. The first being terrorism is a universal problem and is not related to one religion or faith. 2, why is the West trying hard to associate terrorism with Islam and Muslims? 3, Islam does not incite terrorism. 4, does the situation in the Middle East and the foreign policies of the Western countries justify acts of terrorism? 5, what should Muslims do to defend themselves against the West, bearing in mind that the West is the party that conducted and still conducts terrorism on both the individual and at state levels? So I answered that. I've got my answer here on the 30th of July. I answered each question point by point, and he used them. And then coming to Brixton's involvement now with conferences, we held a conference on Saturday, the 6th of August 2005, between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. And that was being held at the mosque. We did hold a subsequent event in the recreation centre, which was just down the road. And the title of this particular one-day event was Islamic Condemnation of Terrorism and the London Bombings. And the title of the talks, there were 4 of them: The Islamic View on Terrorism, Islam's Opposition to Killing the Innocent, Extremism in Islam was the 3rd lecture, and 4th, Brixton Mosque Opposes Terrorism. We also had Canterbury Productions, who had been in touch with us, saying that they wanted to do a 6-part documentary called Mosque. And in that, they were going to interview and get a bird's eye view as well of the activities of the Salafi community. And they interviewed members from Luton, interviewed members from Brixton, and they followed even some colleagues who came abroad to Saudi Arabia for Umrah, and one of them came to work. And I'll read in summary just 3 of those episodes to give you an idea. It was a well-received episode series, and it was aired during Ramadan. And this is the description here. This special 6-part series, to coincide with the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, goes behind the scenes at 2 mosques to discover what those that worship there really believe. Episode 1 was coverage of a special conference in Brixton to discuss the war on terror, where a radical preacher blames traditional mosques for getting out of touch with Muslim youth. People from the mosque go paintballing with a youth project from Luton. Episode 2. 10 days before the start of Ramadan, British Muslims joined demonstrators in an anti-war march through London, where many express anger at the continuing war. Brixton and Luton mosques go on with their project to help ex-prisoners from falling prey to the extremists, and several ex-offenders describe their experiences. Ramadan starts. And I'll end on this particular episode here for this series. Abdul Qadir from the Luton Quarter Islam Centre travels to Saudi Arabia and meets with one of the Brixton Mosque trustees, being myself. While back in Britain, the fast is broken for the Ramadan evening meal. News of the Pakistan earthquakes devastates the Luton congregation. It was an excellent series, which is still easy to access. We also saw another terror conference on Saturday, August the 27th, 2005, that was from 2:30 p.m. to 8:45, and we had introductions and domestics for lectures from Abu Haja, one of the trustees. Our press officer, Abdul Haq Kufi Ade, he started at 3:10. Abu Osama al-Dhahabi gave a lecture on Islamic opposition to killing the innocent at 3:15. Then we had Sheikh Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab al-Aqil, 4:30, the Islamic view on terrorism. After prayer at 5:45, that was Asr that was prayed. Abu Sahib al-Madabi gave a lecture 6:30 p.m. entitled Extremism in Islam. And then 7:30, Imam Umar gave a lecture. Brixton Mosque opposes terrorism. And then the final lecture of the evening was at 8:45 p.m. entitled The Reality of Abu Qatada, a refutation on Abu Qatada al-Falastini by Sheikh Abdul Malik Ramadani. So these were some of the conferences that were taking place. The activity ramped up. And I want to make a point here. The religious instruction that we were receiving, I haven't given much prominence to that. Regular classes were undoubtedly taking place in Brixton and other Salafi centres. However, the inculcation and learning that we had received from the 90s was now kicking into play, because we had to be on the front foot, refuting, countering and addressing the extremist narrative since that event of 7/7 and those attacks from these violently radicalized individuals. We also put out a statement on the 8th of August because the late Zaki Badawi, rahimahullah, gave a fatwa calling for women to remove their hijab if they were afraid. And we countered that narrative by giving a nuanced but firm encouragement for the sisters in the community and Muslims across Britain who observe hijab to continue wearing their hijab, but to be more vigilant and to immediately contact the authorities or seek help from anyone they could if they felt fear of attack. I'll draw to a conclusion now to highlight some of the media headlines that were there following the 7/7 attacks. And I looked through my archives, and to be quite frank, this could be a 2-hour podcast without batting an eyelid with the amount of data and resources that I have to touch upon 7/7 and what transpired following that event. And I would still not cover everything if I did that. However, I want to draw to a conclusion because I am focusing on a specific remit. And I will refer, as I said, to some titles. We saw in the Times today further suspects held after the raid in Stockwell. Armed police arrested a man at a block of flats. This was in the days after the attack in Stockwell, London. This individual said he worshipped at Brixton Mosque. We had no knowledge of who this individual was. We see from The Guardian on the 16th of July, them focusing on the amount of conversions, because there was still a number of conversions taking place post 7/7. And references were being made to Brixton Mosque again being an African Caribbean predominant attended mosque. Those who, quote, those who worship at Brixton Mosque, an Islamic cultural centre in South London, which is attended by a large number of black converts with origins in both Africa and the Caribbean, said yesterday that they had long felt under attack. Abdul Haq, our press officer, spoke very eloquently and elucidated about the ludicrous accusations that because of one convert after 7/7 and a convert with 9/11, following 9/11 with Richard Reed, means that disproportionately converts are a problem with regards to violent radicalization. Looking again on the 13th of August, the title here from Times Online, Captive Converts, and it's asking what makes Islam so attractive to prisoners, ex-convicts. Then we move to the article that I said I was going to touch upon at the very beginning. We have a special investigation on the 14th of August from The Independent that's highlighting, are the Muslim boys using profits of crime to fund terrorists? And this was Shiv Malik, who's quite dramatic in his reporting, a sensationalist type of reporter. That was an article there. The Guardian Unlimited in August, 16th of August 2005, reproduced a declaration from Muslim groups, 38 Muslim entities, the first one being the 1990 Trust, the final one being Yvonne Ridley, political editor of Islam Channel, writing and condemning extremism, and this was advertised throughout the country. And we had the Assistant Commissioner Brian Paddock, who I mentioned, some of the trustees were going to meet, him denying that there was a war on Islam and calling for better dialogue with the Muslims. I'm going to refer to Shura minutes, committee meeting minutes of the 19th of October, in which colleagues met with Chris Lee, the Assistant Chief Executive of Lambeth Council, and they discussed particular aspects that they wanted to cooperate on and collaborate from the Muslim perspective with the community initiatives and with the council initiatives. And finally, I want to refer to some of the data extrapolated from the FOSIS Muslim Student Survey 2005, entitled The Voice of Muslim Students, a report into the attitudes and perceptions of Muslim students following the July 7th London attacks. And the reason I want to focus on this is because it will give an insight into the general populace of Muslim students, juxtaposed against that of the extremists, when you look at and consider some of the data that was obtained. So, for example, attitudes towards extremism. And the question here was, do you condemn the London attacks? 85% said yes. 4% said no. Those who refused to or were reluctant to respond was 11%. And then the next question, would you tell the police if you found that a fellow Muslim was planning an attack? And what we saw was that 72% of Muslims said they would inform the police straight away. The reason I'm highlighting this is because the accusations of informer and such like, and this places the extremists on the fringes of communities, because they're seeing here that many, if they knew with certainty, which is a civic duty and a religious duty, if they knew with certainty that an individual was planning an attack, they would inform or notify the authorities. Now, we have a slightly different take, where we would speak in the way that 8% spoke, which was they'd try to talk them out of it first. They would try and convince and do their level best. That was a minority who said that, and that's very important. 2% said they would never do it. They would never speak against a Muslim. This would be something that is metaphorically music to the extremists' ears. Of another 2%, and we share that 2% understanding as well, they mistrust or are scared of the police, and this is what would contribute to their reluctance to notify the authorities. 6% did not specify. No response was from 10% of the population who were interviewed in that instance. So, asking about foreign policy, 62% of these Muslim students believed that the British foreign policy played a major or complete role in causing the London bombings. 83% of them felt unhappy with British foreign policy, citing the war in Iraq and the unresolved Palestinian situation as the top two grievances, while 17% of students dislike everything about foreign policy. Finally, again, on this research, over 1/3, 38% of respondents to the question about Muslim disunity mentioned it as the biggest problem facing the Muslim community. The second biggest problem was felt to be a lack of Islamic education, and just 11% called for more effective leadership. I would proffer that there is more need of Muslim leadership today than ever before, due to the disparate nature of the communities and our inability to speak with one voice.